For several years, Epic had been madly expanding their group of developers, and 1995 and 6 saw a few more new faces, but also featured many of the people who had worked under them before coming back with new titles. In 1995, their musician Robert A. Allen banded together with some others under the name Eclipse Games. This produced Tyrian, marking Epic's return to the shoot-'em-up genre with a logo with a degree of symmetry that would please any typographer, geometrist or power metal band. It was created largely as an homage to Zanuck, a vertical shooter that was first released on the MSX home computers, which were Microsoft designed but primarily Japanese bought. And there is honestly so much in this game, buried in layers of episodes, mechanics and secrets, that it frankly intimidated me out of writing this video for a very long time. Nevertheless, I'm going to give it my best try. The game's story is centred around the planet Tyrian and is set in the year 20,031, which should make sure that the actual real-life date won't inconveniently catch up with the game for a while yet. You take the role of a pilot/industrial rock artist called Trent Hawkins, who has been assigned to explore the newly terraformed planet to identify habitable areas. Soon enough, he finds out the company Microsol, who he's been working for, has the ulterior motive of mining the planet for its unique mineral gravitium, building a fleet of warships that utilise its gravity-altering powers and generally taking over the universe. Knowing that they're out to eliminate him before he spills their secret, he grabs a small fighter ship and attempts to escape to the planet Savara, and the game's storyline unfolds from there. In terms of gameplay, as you'll have noticed by now, this means there's going to be a lot of vertical scrolling shooter action as Trent fights his way out of Microsoft's clutches. It's made to look as much like an arcade shoot-'em-up as it possibly can. This even extends to it rather pretentiously asking you to insert coin during the demo, even though the game doesn't run on an arcade machine and never has. All the usual features of scrolling shooters apply here. You bravely pilot your lone tiny craft through an overwhelming array of air traffic barreling in the other direction, blasting at targets both in the air and on the ground in exchange for points and power-ups, and defeating a large boss aircraft at the north end of the map to earn your way out of the level. Then you spend your points upgrading your ship and then move on to the next wave. These are all pretty standard features for a shoot-'em-up, but given the time it was released, Tyrian bears a strong resemblance to Apogee Software's Raptor, which had come out the previous year. I couldn't help noticing that the two games even share some explosion samples from the same sound effects library. However, Tyrian has a much lighter feel to it and doesn't have anywhere near the same gritty rendered graphical style. Instead, it goes for a very bold outlined and colourful look that give the game a much lighter feel, and there's more of a zoomed out view with your ship being fairly small, so it feels like you have more room to move around the screen. Most of the levels feature layers upon layers of parallax scrolling, which looks great visually, but it can sometimes be hard to tell what's solid ground versus decoration, or to identify the pickups among the deadly projectiles coming down the screen towards you. The game first reveals its depth in the setup screen between levels, which presents a frankly dizzying array of options for customizing your ship. The weaponry you have available is divided into 4 categories: your front and rear guns and your left and right sidekicks. For the weapons on the front and back, you're given the option to attach a choice of various lasers, beams and fireballs, each of which can individually be literally dialed up to 11 different levels to change the weapon's firing pattern or enhance its general deadliness. If you're looking at your rear guns, you also have 2 different modes available which can be toggled in-game, and which generally toggle between providing more firepower up at the front or around the sides of your ship. Your left and right sidekicks are miniature devices that float around after you and provide supporting fire. Some of these will fire when you do, but others have limited shots available at once and have to be fired with dedicated left and right sidekick keys. Defensive options are more limited but no less important. The shield category lets you choose unsurprisingly between several different strengths of shield, and you also have to make sure you have a generator on board your ship that's capable of powering the whole thing. Each shot you make consumes power, and if you run out of it, your shields won't be able to recharge and you'll fire a lot slower. So during your customization, you have to make sure the power bar shown on the right hand side of the ship display isn't draining over time with the fire rate of the onboard weapons you've chosen. If it does, then you have to make a decision about whether you want to rebalance your weapon selections and levels, spend points on a heavier generator instead, or alternatively just choose to scrape by and assume you're not going to be hit by anything. Finally, at certain points throughout the game, you even get the chance to swap out the body of your ship entirely, which determines the base amount of armour that you have along with your appearance in the game. You earn your upgrades by destroying things and picking up tokens during the levels. Your score is inconsistently referred to both as money and as upgrade points by the game, but it makes more sense to call them upgrade points because you never spend them irreversibly. Everything that you can put onto your ship can be taken off again, and you get back all the points you spent when you installed it, so you're free to change configurations entirely whenever you like and respec your ship to suit an upcoming level, or to use your gradually expanding points bank in a different way. Somewhat confusingly, not all the weapons, ships or items are available for you to swap in and out after every level, and the selection doesn't just expand throughout the game either. Each time you reach a new destination, it will have its own selection of things in its shop, so it's very possible to miss your opportunity to buy certain things, and the issue is complicated further by the fact that there isn't just one route through the game. Several levels give you the chance to access secret stages or will prompt you to choose a route. To help out with this, many online guides for the game provide a tree of the level choices available and a table of upgrades with their availability at each point in the game so that you can plan your purchases better. When you begin a new game, you're given several options of exactly which new game you want to play, choosing the full game, an arcade mode, or a timed battle. The full game has everything that I've just described and plays out like a story mode, where you can collect data cubes within the stages and then read them on the setup screen afterwards to gather advice on upcoming missions or piece together fragments of the story. This sounds like an interesting idea, but it's very easy to miss certain cubes if they're hidden in fast-moving enemies, making following the story fairly confusing. In my game, Trent must have been given a massive shock by receiving a letter offering condolences on the death of his parents before he'd heard that they'd been killed. Arcade mode dispenses with most of the complexities and lets you play the game as a fairly straight shoot-'em-up. The upgrade system is ditched and replaced with you picking up weapons and upgrades within the levels. It also allows you to use some special weapons that are unique to arcade mode if you power up a weapon all the way to its maximum potential. Timed Battle, which became available in later versions of Tyrian, is a special mode with just 3 different challenges where the player is judged on how long they take to complete a level, along with how many ships they destroyed and how badly they were beaten up in the process. There's also a 2-player variant on the arcade mode, which has interesting cooperative gameplay where the players can either control their ships separately or combine them into one like an episode of the Power Rangers and let one player handle the flying while the second player controls a rotatable turret. In addition to these 4 standard modes, there are probably about a dozen more that are available through various cheat codes and secrets. Each time you complete a standard game, you'll be given a code word that you can type in on the main menu to play through a super arcade mode with a new hidden type of ship. And if you type Engage on the main menu, it will melt away and you'll be dumped into Super Tyrian on a special difficulty setting after an upfront warning about its general unfairness. And I could go on for much longer than I already have about some of the hidden extra challenges beyond the hard difficulty setting that let you upgrade the game to Impossible into Suicide, or the hidden fighting game style special move inputs, or the way that your ship has an 18% chance of turning into a carrot on completion of a full cycle of the game. It really is absolute madness. Oh, and there's also a whole hidden Scorched Earth style tank war game in it as well. So in conclusion, Tyrian definitely had a lot of depth to it. Despite all this, it didn't have as painfully enormous a number of episodes as some other Epic titles, but it did have an unusually long string of re-releases that together form an entire dynasty of Tyrian games. Or if you prefer American English, an entire dynasty of Tyrian games. The first release of the game in 1995 consisted of the officially mandated 3 episodes: Escape, Treachery and Mission Suicide. A short time later, the game was patched to version 2, which introduced the 2-player mode, fixed some bugs and added a 4th episode called An End to Fate. A few years after that, the game got another release published by the now defunct XSIV Games, which was called Tyrian 2000. This added another episode called Hazardra Fodder, bringing the total to 5, and also added some new ship secrets and features to the game, and this is the version that I've been using throughout the video. As it was finished in 1999, it also has the honour of being one of the last DOS games ever made that wasn't just a straight re-release. In addition to all of these, 2 handheld versions were almost released, one for the Game Boy Color and another for the Game Boy Advance. They got quite far in development, but were passed around between a couple of different publishers and were both ultimately cancelled. After silence for a long time, the coder Jason Emery found them in a box somewhere and released them for free in 2007. An iPhone version of the game was released in 2009, followed by an iPad one the next year, and a fan-made sequel called Unfinished Business was planned, but as of today its business remains unfinished. Getting back to the actual version that exists on the PC, I've had no difficulty getting the DOS version of Tyrian to work under Windows 10, apart from it crashing DOSBox every time it quits. It's been freeware since 2004, and the 2000 edition can be downloaded from GOG.com. Earlier versions are also available on the bare-bones but still functional Caminus.net. The downloads of the registered version also come with a well-intentioned but ultimately clumsy ship editor that you can use to import your own graphics and to set your own base custom stats. Additionally, in 2007, the Pascal and assembly source code and the game's graphic files were given to a group of developers to remake, resulting in the open source version Open Tyrian. Finally, Tyrian's excellent soundtrack was also released for free on Bandcamp in 2010. It's available under Alexander Brandon's account. Tyrian was one of the first games he worked on, acting as both musician and designer, and he entered the Epic fold just in time to be featured heavily in the Unreal series. James Schmaltz also made a return in 1995 with his mainstay, the pinball genre, bringing the number of pinball games he'd written for Epic up to 3. This one was called Extreme Pinball, named after Schmaltz's own company, Digital Extremes, and was another revision on the same basic idea that had been started in Silverball and then taken further by Epic Pinball. It also had the honour of being the first Epic game to make its way to consoles, being ported to the PlayStation a year after its release, and then later even being made available on the PlayStation Network. Extreme Pinball covers most of the same ground that Epic Pinball did, with a couple of upgrades to the engine. Most noticeably, the resolution has been doubled to an unusual 320x400 screen mode with extra wide pixels. This allows for very visually detailed tables that manage not to be as dense and completely overwhelming as the later tables from Epic Pinball. The dot matrix display is also made much more elaborate, with some flashy 3D-like graphics flying around instead of sticking to just displaying the score. The detail in the dot matrix really isn't anything to speak of for graphics on a computer in the year 1995, but in the context of the simulation, it's a nice touch that instantly makes it feel like you're playing more modern tables than the other games offered. In contrast to its predecessor's degree of pinball madness, this game is positively miniature with just 4 tables available. There's Medieval Knights, which marks a return to the fantasy theme as seen in the first table on Silverball, Rock Fantasy, which is very guitar and music business themed, a rather unfortunate looking one about police and riots called Urban Chaos, and a table about an astronaut stranded on a planet full of monkeys called Monkey Mayhem. As usual, you have to hit various buttons, lights, doodads and thingamybobs to accumulate score, while avoiding the ball going down the middle or the lanes on the left or right sides. To this end, you're given a frankly inadequate seeming pair of flippers and some controls to simulate banging against the pinball table to nudge the ball a bit. New to these tables is a very welcome mercy feature, where you'll be prompted for a do-over without losing a ball if it drains very quickly after entering play. Again, in a bit of a downgrade from Epic Pinball, I couldn't find any instructions about how any of these tables were meant to be played anywhere. No online rules are provided in the game, and the included helpme.exe just talks about minimum system requirements and troubleshooting. So my usual frantic pummeling of the keyboard to vaguely encourage the ball up the table had to suffice. However, I quickly noticed a problem with using the shift keys, as the game would only recognise them one at a time, and I couldn't flip one flipper if I was already holding down the other one. I'm guessing that this might have just been an issue with running it through DOSBox, and I was able to get around it by using the right arrow key for my right flippers instead. Robert A. Allen was once again on board for the music, and he continued to use the PSM format to provide his great soundtrack. This time around, the game takes advantage of Module Music's ability to jump between segments of a song to synchronise the music with what's going on in the game. Each file contains multiple different music loops, and certain events will cause the music to change to a different pattern to alter the mood if you're frantically racing to get a bonus, or conversely have just dropped the ball down the middle. Despite being a slight upgrade to Epic Pinball, which was released just a couple of years earlier, Extreme was derided as very old-fashioned on its release, and it didn't enjoy any of the same commercial or critical success. This is a reminder of just how fast the computer game industry was moving during the mid-90s, as sprite-based graphics weren't impressing people anymore and were quickly being replaced with the new and exciting world of goo-rod shading and polygons before we realised that those actually looked atrocious. Despite its limited number of tables, and being released at an unfortunate time when there wasn't really space for it, Extreme Pinball is still an interesting look at how the engine behind Epic Pinball was taken a couple of steps further. As always, Extreme Pinball had a shareware version available which consisted of just the Rock Fantasy table and some previews of the others. This version is still available around the internet, but I can't find a way of buying the full game. What's really interesting about the shareware version though is that in its ordering information it contains the first glimpse of Unreal. At this early point in development it was evidently about going on a fantasy quest to get your clothes back. It would be 3 more years until the game actually released, and it transformed a lot in tone and setting from these early screens, but these are the first hints that Epic was planning a new full 3D game that would truly live up to their company's name. Epic also made a return to first-person shooting in 1995 with an unusual game called Radix Beyond the Void. It was written by Storm Entertainment, who were a newcomer to the Epic family who seemed to disappear as fast as they had appeared, with the members splitting up and going their own ways very quickly. It's also very interesting that Cygnus Multimedia are mentioned in the game's credits, as they had just come off working on Raptor and Hocus Pocus for Apogee Software. What Storm Entertainment produced is a fusion of first-person shooter and flight simulator along the lines of 3D Realm's Terminal Velocity and especially Descent by Parallax Software. You find yourself behind the controls of a hovering spacecraft and have to navigate your way through the confines of alien bases, free to fly anywhere in the environments as you blow things up and avoid being blown up in kind. The story goes that in the 22nd century, humanity has begun to colonise beyond the solar system, but one of the 2 massive colony ships that left Earth has been dragged into a hole in reality by an alien race that has now taken their intended destination for themselves. After some hasty research, a lone spacecraft has been cobbled together that's capable of jumping between dimensions, and it's been dispatched to the edge of the solar system to slip past the enemy defences and bring the fight back to them. Unlike most other shooter games of this era, this story unfolds a little as you play in the form of a detailed briefing that comes up before each mission. In each one of these, you're given 1 or more different objectives for you to achieve to complete the level. It's true that they don't really advance beyond go here and shoot this thing, but it does tie the setting into the game a little rather than having the levels all just be a string of anonymous environments that you have to fight through to reach the exit. However, in visual design the levels are unfortunately fairly indistinct. Most of the game is greyer than Aberdeen on a foggy day, and there isn't a lot of variation in textures between the levels until you get to the very red 3rd chapter where the enemies start actually standing out from the background. Combined with the VGA 320x200 resolution, you really have to squint at the game to make out anything much at all. The enemies and pickups are all sprites that have been rendered from 3D models, and often there isn't a huge amount of difference between the ships, so it's hard to identify what you're shooting at even if you can see it against the wall. In keeping with tradition, the weapons available to you are assigned to the number keys and generally increase in terms of stopping power as you move up. You begin with a neutron cannon that shoots blue stars and is a fairly good all-round projectile weapon. You can find upgrades throughout the levels that allow it to fire more energy bolts at the same time. It's also rechargeable, with each shot draining some of your energy meter. If this runs out, you have to wait for it to climb up again or switch to one of the higher weapons that have their own separate ammunition counts. These include a rapid-fire hit-scan gun, lasers, missiles, and all the usual elements of a well-rounded arsenal. These all help you fight off the enemy ships coming your way, and there will be a ton of them. Because this game uses sprites, it can fling a lot of stuff around at the same time, so the game tends to be much faster paced than something like Quake or even Descent, where the number of enemies you fight at a time is usually quite limited. But I have to be honest and say that something else you'll be fighting against is the truly dreadful default control layout. Radix is set up so that the mouse is used to control your pitch and direction, which is actually a very forward-thinking default that anticipated the dual use of keyboard and mouse for full 3D games that's lasted until the current day. Then it swiftly goes and ruins it by mapping your accelerate and reverse keys to right, shift and M, and putting afterburners between the two on /. Your weapons can be fired with control and space. Your 6th and 7th fingers have to stretch up to the top of the keyboard to get to the throttle and weapon selection keys, and you're left to cover the other end of the keyboard for strafing by any means necessary. Mercifully, there is a setup program which you can use to remap everything to a configuration that's even slightly sane, including an option to toggle the inverted y-axis, which is somewhat confusingly called reverse flight controls. Once I found this, the game suddenly became a lot more enjoyable. You can't really blame the authors of the game for all this, as nobody had really worked out how to effectively control 6 degree of freedom movement yet, but it does take some legwork on the player's part to set it up. The Radix is capable of flying at a tremendous rate, and the help file provided with the game specifically encourages more maniacal players to take some time and slow down to avoid crashing endlessly into walls. Frankly, whoever recorded the demo for the game could also have benefited from taking this advice. Thankfully, you don't take any damage from scraping against or ramming straight into walls, as you'll be doing this a lot before you get used to how quickly you can strafe or move up and down. The ship's cockpit view looks nice, but unfortunately blocks off a lot of the screen, and I found the game more comfortable to play with it turned off, even though the HUD in this mode is much less informative. There's also an exciting looking but difficult to play third-person view where the camera follows behind your ship and makes the game look a bit like Star Fox. Radix Beyond the Void is an interesting game, and despite its rough edges I found myself slowly getting into it as I got used to it, but sadly it's another one that came out a bit too late to really make an impact. It uses its own engine that's like finding some missing link in an evolutionary ladder that lies between Descent and Duke Nukem 3D. Its maps are laid out with non-orthogonal walls, varying heights and even ramps, but the engine is based on a 2D plan and doesn't have the ability to have rooms above rooms or let the player look up and down properly. In a 6 Degrees of Freedom game, the lack of a full 3D environment is a major drawback that severely limits the player's range of movement as well as the shape and variety of the maps, although to be fair it probably makes the levels much less confusing to navigate. As a result of other games overtaking it, Radix wasn't a success and reportedly didn't even make enough money to break even. Its downloads have pretty much disappeared from the internet now, apart from a couple of sites that still have the shareware version. In an attempt to redeem it, the authors released a new version called Remix V2.0 which replaced some of the levels, added new art assets and generally touched the game up to make it a bit more appealing. One of the big changes was to make the ship much more manoeuvrable. In the first edition, the game was set up rather unwisely so that the ship would gradually drift forward at a constant speed, but the remix version gets rid of this, lets the ship hover in place and has the ability to reverse. Instantly, this makes the game much more satisfying to play, and it's unfortunate that such an odd decision marred the original game so much. An editor called RadCAD was also released for players of the registered version, but apart from a couple of mentions here and there, I haven't been able to find any sign of a download. Safari Software was now a division of Epic Megagames, and their last contribution to Epic's lineup under their own name was another shooter called Seek and Destroy, written by a company in New Zealand called Vision Software. The game had originally been released in 1993 on the Amiga, and it bears a strong resemblance to Electronic Arts' 1992 game Desert Strike. In Seek and Destroy, you take the role of a pilot caught in some of America's indistinguishable conflicts, and you venture out from your base to the enemy, who conveniently live next door, and bother them by stealing their scientists or destroying some of their buildings. This game takes more of a Zone 66 approach than a Tyrian one, as you're free to roam around the war zone as you like. However, each level only features your own base and a cluster of enemy buildings, so there isn't a whole lot of point to exploring elsewhere. The game rotates the playfield as you move around to keep your vehicle nailed rigidly to the same spot on screen, which is an impressive effect, but one that some people might find pretty nauseating. Fortunately, I seem to be immune to this myself, but I've read that having at least some sway in your camera work here can make it seem less like the entire world is rotating underneath your vehicle. In each mission, your task is to venture into hostile territory and seek and/or destroy certain enemy targets while trying not to run afoul of their defense systems. In order to achieve this, you have a choice of 2 war machines available to you. There's a helicopter, which can hover nimbly around enemy bases and strafe their defences, and a tank, which is so blatantly inferior to the helicopter that the game occasionally forces you to use it just to remind you that it's still there. It does have the nice feature of a rotatable turret, so you can trundle past bases while firing to your left or right side, but it can be very hard to get your brain around the controls for turning the turret, firing and moving the tank out of danger simultaneously. Overall, the tank is much more awkward to manoeuvre, not helped by its tendency to crash into trees if you're not paying attention. In between missions, you're given the opportunity to set up your killing machine of choice with a selection of weapons which can be purchased in exchange for medals that you can find out in the field, usually by destroying enemy buildings. Each weapon has a couple of different levels you can upgrade it to. Going straight to the highest tier is the cheapest option, but there is a small upgrade discount if you choose a more basic model first. You then have to load up your weapon bays with a selection of the ones that you've purchased. The more bays a weapon is assigned to, the more ammunition for that weapon you'll start off with. To be honest though, I had more success sticking with just one weapon and maximising my ammunition for it, rather than taking a variety along with me. You can also set up your balance of fuel, armour and speed on this screen. Fuel and armour can be recharged with pickups or by flying back to base to refuel, but you'll have to keep an eye on both gauges to make sure you stay alive. Starting in the middle of the game, you also really have to start watching your ammunition, switching between weapons as needed and picking more up whenever you can. I spent a while playing around trying different control schemes, but eventually found myself sticking to the keyboard. Mouse control is provided as an option, but it's implemented pretty strangely. If you look towards the bottom middle of the screen, you can see a square view with a green blob bouncing around in it, and this is what you control with the mouse, as if they were trying to get it to simulate an analog joystick. To stop moving, you have to return your mouse to the centre, rather than just stop moving it. After a few minutes to get used to it, this control scheme doesn't seem as absolutely horrendous as it might sound, but it didn't offer the increased manoeuvrability over the keyboard that I had hoped. In particular, there's no way to strafe and perform any other movements simultaneously. It's always controlled with a toggle key that locks your forward and backward movement. Once you get around the control oddities though, the game is a lot of fun. It's a little one note because despite the varying mission objectives, you end up just levelling the entire enemy base on every mission anyway. It would have been good to have some more restrictions on flight, like hilly terrain that forces you to have to find creative ways around enemy defences instead of just picking them off one by one, or to have thought up some reason you'd actually choose to use the tank. But it does a lot to make up for its simplicities by making everything about the gameplay really satisfying. The graphics are simple but very crisp, especially considering that it runs in 320 by 240 VGA. Everything explodes very pleasingly, both visually and orally as you shoot at it. You get awarded an overkill bonus occasionally, for reasons I'm not entirely clear on, and the difficulty curve is good, with enemy firepower gradually increasing and demanding that you become more careful throughout the game. It has to be said that Seek and Destroy is a very short game. It's only got 20 missions, 8 of which were available in the shareware version, and you can complete the whole thing pretty easily in about an hour and a half. However, there is the promise of some replayability if you want to try going through the game again with a completely different weapon setup, or perhaps by only using the tank if you're mad. And it doesn't drag on or outstay its welcome. It feels the right length for what it is, was priced comparatively low at $20 on release, and it's a fun thing to zoom through quickly. Not that I can find anywhere to buy it just now, which is sort of sad. We're now drifting into 1996, and by this time Windows 95 and CD-ROMs had transformed the PC from being a competitor among many home computers into something that were coming into virtually every home. Therefore, we've now reached the end of an era. Seek and Destroy would be the last game that Epic and its partners would release for DOS, with all future titles aimed at Microsoft's new and exciting visual operating system.